Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and difficulty in MMORPGs has always been a hot topic. The game's too hard, the game's too easy, can we please just get content? These are things I've heard throughout my many years of playing MMORPGs. And the funny thing with Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, it's introduced kind of a new direction for the game. It's experimenting hardcore, not in that way, with new ideas for fight design, and this goes from regular dungeons, to normal trials, to extremes, and now even the raids. And to me, it seems as if the pace of the game has gone up a decent chunk, at least. All the while experimenting with new ways to telegraph information to the player, and to be more creative in terms of the actual fight design, and these are things that I think should be applauded. Because of everything I've done so far in terms of actual gameplay content in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, I've heavily enjoyed. There was like one dungeon in the Expert Roulette, which just had like the, we're gonna put two things under two cups and spin them around, keep track of them, that I'm like, okay, but like that's it. Everything else, and especially Arcadian, I've absolutely been enthralled by. I've loved this expansion when it comes to the actual gameplay of it, and with conversations erupting now over the actual difficulty of the normal mode raids and the content overall in Dawntrail, I want to take a minute to talk about gameplay in Final Fantasy XIV. And I mainly want to talk about introducing gameplay into the MSQ, but we have to cover a few bases first. 1. Final Fantasy XIV is an old game. It's been out for over 10 years. And if you don't vary up the gameplay at some point there, then people who have played enough will grow a bit tired of seeing the same old tricks time and time again. Varying up the gameplay and introducing new things to tackle and to learn and overcome is something that I don't only think is a good thing, I think it's needed. And Dawntrail has been super refreshing in that regard, even as somebody who has never really played hardcore in Final Fantasy XIV, but has played the game since Stormblood. Every piece of content feels super refreshing, especially when I'm going to do my roulettes and I get older dungeons and stuff. Everything feels far slower. I vastly prefer the pace of Dawntrail in that regard, and the mechanics just feel as if they are a breath of fresh air. They are fun to overcome, learn, and play around. And at the end of the day, entertainment and what you find fun is going to be subjective, and not everyone will find this enjoyable. However, I feel as if the vast majority of people I've interacted with, or have seen comments from, have overall been really receptive to the actual gameplay of Dawntrail. And there's a phenomenon I see, especially when it comes to MMORPGs, that I think needs to be talked about, and that is this hyper-catering to the 1%. And I'm not just talking about the upper 1%, I'm namely talking about the bottom 1% here. Let's face it, it's a video game, and at the end of the day, there's going to be a subsect of people that are just not good at it, and that's fine. 14 is a game with varying difficulty modes and types of content, so that you can probably find a place if you want to get better, or just settle into your niche. There's nothing wrong with that, however, and this is not a 14 specific problem, I found this everywhere. There are people that almost take pride in being bad at the game and act as if it's almost a personality trait. And it's very similar in thinking to when you come across people that act as if being good at the game is a personality trait, just on the opposite end of the spectrum, where they feel as if the game should cater to them specifically and only them. Or they use exaggeration and hyperbole to try and prove their point, when it's really a shaky foundation. Or act as if there's nothing in the game that caters to their super specific niche, that when you stop to think about it, most people wouldn't particularly care about. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit when it comes to Dawntrail as well. We're always going to, especially when they try to introduce new ways to telegraph information, even if at the end of the day it's a Final Fantasy XIV mechanic, danger zone, safe spot, go to a safe spot. At the end of the day, no matter what you do, there's going to be some people that simply don't want to play the game, they don't want to interact or interface with the game, and they want something that requires absolutely no brain power whatsoever. There's nothing wrong with wanting that. I take issue with the idea that the game should cater to that mindset specifically, and this idea that quite a few people in MMORPGs tends to have, where they exaggerate this idea that this audience is way larger than it actually is. Again, there's nothing wrong with being bad at the game. The issue I tend to find is when this mindset interferes with actual game design. I think we have seen this in the MSQ of Dawntrail. If you go and turn the page back to Endwalker had quite a few gameplay scenarios within its MSQ that varied up the flow and tried to incorporate storytelling through the gameplay. You can think of sections like the Thancred infiltration section that gave us the infamous meme, "This is Thancred," which felt extremely Metal Gear inspired, and then you had the escape section from Golemald, where you took the role of a Gallian soldier trying to escape the city. And if you remember back in the the day, there were quite a few people vocal about how they had such disdain for these sections of the game. And I think Square Enix overcompensated and just didn't have any sections like that when it came to Dawntrail. The only sections that really felt unique into the gameplay were those 1v1 scenarios against, say, Bakul Jaja, where you played as Wuklamat, or against Golul Jaja, where you played as the Warrior of Light, or that one scenario that was like totally not a child where you fought the shade of Golul Jaja, and that's kinda it. Now, I'm not even the biggest fan of those sections from Endwalker, but I don't think the existence of those sections was the issue. I think it was more the execution, because the gameplay loops you got, namely when it came to the Gulmald section as the soldier, we got like a scuffed gladiator or a paladin kit. It was extremely slow. That was just boring because it wasn't engaging in terms of an actual fun gameplay loop, but I liked the idea of having a section that was intense, where we didn't feel quite as powerful as we normally do. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy XIV is a video game, and incorporating story into the gameplay loop is something that should be upheld. It should be something actively worked on and iterated, not shied away from, because the first iteration of this wasn't the most well executed. And I think it wasn't the most well executed because of this inherent fear of the skill issue. The MSQ is something that everyone is expected to be able to accomplish. That includes that very bottom end of players. Again, there's nothing wrong with not being good at a video game, but it's this overcompensation, in my opinion, that leads to subpar gameplay mechanics that are both forgettable and that don't add much to the actual loop, or the experience on the whole. Like that one gladiator section where we were supposed to feel really slow and not powerful. That's fine, but the problem is when you have an MMO gameplay loop, when it's overly slow, it becomes uninteresting with too much frequent rhythmic downtime. Hotkey-based combat is not that fun when it's really slow, with too few abilities. It becomes really stale, unresponsive, and just uninteresting and unrewarding. And if you agree with that sentiment, then I think naturally your logical conclusion would be, okay, well, to add more on top of it and add to the pace. The problem is, especially if you've played MMOs for years, you'll understand that if you give anyone a rotation that is not their character or their job, they act as if like they're a melting block of cheese in a fondue pot or something. Like they don't understand what to do, because nobody wants to take the 2 seconds needed to stop and read the tooltips. Even if the rotations are extremely easy, you don't want to make these sections too involved, because at the end of the day, they're not going to be repeated forms of content. They're just like a bite-sized piece of gameplay for that one situation to make it a bit unique. Now, I think there are still ways to make that fun and engaging. That is by simply upping the pace of the GCD, adding to the visual spectacle, having great music, making just a spectacle overall, having good enemy design, stuff like that. There's multiple ways to tackle this problem, and I don't think just shying away from the concept overall is necessarily the way to go about it. The MSQ and the content for the MSQ will always be easy by design, because everyone is expected to be able to make their way through it. There's nothing wrong with that. My issue is when you use that as an excuse to shy away from interesting gameplay scenarios in lieu of just making it a cutscene. Because at the end of the day, it's a video game. It's not a book, it's not an anime, it's not a movie, it's not a comic, it's a video game. And video games are inherently interactive media. And when your sole way to tell and further a story is through just basic cutscenes and dialogue and essentially yapping, it erodes the quality of the story and the storytelling you could have. For instance, those 1v1 fights we got, even back in Endwalker against Xenos, and in Dawntrail against Golul Jaja and Bakul Jaja, they were fun. At least they were to me. And they were fun because they are interactive with enough going on, even for that small scene, to where I was always engaged with the game, and I didn't feel as if there was this odd downtime where I just couldn't do anything. And these sections furthered the actual narrative going on in an interesting way, to varying degrees, but they still furthered the narrative through the gameplay. So it's not like it can't be done in Final Fantasy XIV, or that MMOs for some reason are this special concept to where you have to shy away from gameplay because you have to cater to the lowest of the low skill level users. I think it's doing a disservice to the vast majority of people who can actually, rub more than 2 brain cells together to play the game, but also just the people who want a fun game to play. When you started the Dawntrail MSQ, how long did it take to get to an actual situation with gameplay that wasn't just a cutscene or characters talking on the screen? It took a long time, didn't it? a really long time, many hours. And like at the end of the day, Final Fantasy XIV is a story and a game that we all go into expecting a lot of talking and a lot of cutscenes. There's nothing wrong with that, but you cross a point, like a line in the sand, and I think this line varies depending upon the game and the expectations going into the game. So I have a lot more leeway for Final Fantasy XIV than I would have for other games. I go into it expecting all of this. But even then, you can still cross that line to where you need a bit more just something. And I wouldn't argue that this was the biggest issue that I had with Dawntrail's MSQ, but it was one of the significant issues I had with it. And that I think it was wholly uninteresting from a mechanical perspective. There was an entire train section where we operated a turret in the Cowboy Land in Shaloni. That wasn't a gameplay scenario. And maybe it was because they couldn't figure out how to do a turret section in Final Fantasy XIV, in which case I just point them back to the Pixie quests and say you can do some version of this, or don't have us be the one on the turret, have Alize be on it or something while we fight on the back of it. There was an entire situation back in the level 90 quest where Wu Clamart screwed off to go tame an alpaca. That should have been a gameplay scenario. There was content extremely similar to that in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth with taming chocobos out in the wild. A concept that could have easily worked in Final Fantasy XIV with having to sneak up against the alpaca and maybe tame it with rudimentary button inputs or something. It didn't need to be the most drawn out and long form content ever, just something to make it interactive. Now, funnily enough, I don't think there's an easy answer to this problem that Final Fantasy XIV has, if you even think it's a problem. I think one of the solutions Square Enix has kind of fallen on is when they need to do extra gameplay sections is to make them stealth missions. I legit forgot that that Dawntrail had as many of these little stealth sections as it did. They were so forgettable to me because they all boiled down to essentially the same thing. Just hide behind something periodically because the NPC you're following will sometimes turn around if he feels like it. And looking back on it in Endwalker, the Thancred mission and the Escape from Garlemald sections are either Metal Gear inspired stealth sections, or they're like sections that heavily incentivize the use of stealth. And these sections can be really cool in terms of the intensity they bring to the table, but I also think an idea that Square Enix maybe should take to heart is the idea that you can make a gameplay section feel really good, yet still be really mechanically easy and simplistic, just by making the visual spectacle or the feeling and the tone of it feel good. And I know that sounds a bit contradictory, right? I understand that. But we have gameplay in this game, like in the Gold Saucer, where you're on that turret section. That could translate very well. I was actually watching one of Preach Gaming's streams about Dawntrail, and someone in his chat brought this up. It's a great point. You have a section in the Gold Saucer that is pretty much all that you need when it comes to that train bed. Just lift that gameplay and put it there. It would work. It doesn't need to be hard or mechanically complex, because at the end of the day, it's the MSQ, it's going to be really easy. We expect that. But the feeling of it has to be good. The invasion of Tuliolol, that should have been a fight. Should have been this giant combat scenario, kind of in the vein or the style of, say, the final patch of the end of the Shadowbringers MSQ. Remember that? Where we had that giant battle against Fandaniel? Something in that line of thinking. At the end of the day, you need to be willing to take a risk, because you won't know what sticks to the wall and what people are receptive to if you're not willing to take that first step and take that risk. At the end of the day, it is my firmest belief that if you want a game to be fun and interesting mechanically, you have to have gameplay mechanics. There's a ton of games that are really hard that are a lot of fun. I love FromSoft games, but there's also a ton of games out there that are really easy, but also a ton of fun. And at the end of the day, I think Final Fantasy XIV is a fun game. Like, I like playing the game. I like going after these boss fights. I like those fights against Bakul Jaja and Golul Jaja in Dawntrail. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the dungeons. I've enjoyed the trials. I've loved the raid. 14 can be a really fun game, but instead of like shying away from those components that they did quite a bit in the MSQ, they should lean into it and take a chance. They did it a little bit back in Endwalker, and you can even argue with like stuff like the Thancred fight in Shadowbringers, but I think there's underlying fear of having to make sure that everyone can get through it on like basically the first try, and this underlying fear of upsetting anyone out there that plays the game is a net detriment to the overall quality of the game going forward, because it limits creativity and it limits design, especially in terms of the MSQ and what it could be. Just because an idea was not executed all that well before does not mean the idea cannot be executed better or even way better in the future. And like, it's entirely possible that ideas like the Golemald escape section or the Thancred infiltration are just faulty conceptually. Like, that's entirely possible. I'm just saying, I don't think the resolution or the takeaway from that should be we should just not do these one, like, man instances ever again, or these situations that just involve you in a unique gameplay scenario. It doesn't need to be hard, but it needs to be more mechanically satisfying than just simply clicking to the next dialogue option. And I'm also not saying that Final Fantasy XIV shouldn't have a lot of cutscenes or a lot of dialogue. That is its core and its DNA at the end of the day. But like I said, with that line in the sand, I think there's always a point where you can, like, overshoot it. And I think Dawntrail did. Doesn't mean I expect it to become like Doom or something, but there's just too many times in the Dawntrail story where I'm like, oh, this would have been a really cool gameplay situation, and nothing happened. And going back to like the normal mode raids for a minute, when you introduce new ways to telegraph information or new mechanics wholesale, there's going to be some people where they need a bit of time to adjust to this new information and this new way of reading information. It comes quicker or slower to some people, and that's fine. But for a game like Final Fantasy XIV that is as old as it is, and that is planning to go even longer, shying away from doing new things mechanically and from a gameplay perspective should not be the direction. And I think Dawntrail in a lot of ways is trying to experiment with a lot of new things mechanically, at least in terms of fight design, and I think that's a really good thing. I think Dawntrail has been one of the best expansions, if not their best expansion, in terms of the actual gameplay, in terms of the actual boss design, these dungeons, these fights. They're really damn good. I just hope that one day this design can translate, and this level of risk-taking can translate itself to the MSQ, outside of just dungeons. Because I think that'd be pretty cool. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.